Welcome back to the second installment of my worst films of the year list. I watched over 100 new releases this year, and from those I selected the worst of the worst. These films are not just bad, they border on harmful due to either their production or themes. I'm going to go through 10 of the most embarrassing cinematic moments of the year and explain why they're stains on the medium. The only rules for a film to be on this list are that it had to have originally released in the past year, had over 1,000 views on Letterboxd at the time of me writing this, and most importantly, that it's bad. Before we start though, I'm actually going to begin working on this channel again going into the new year, so make sure to subscribe and like this video so you'll get similar content in your recommended feed. Let's get into the list with 5 dishonorable mentions. Black Adam is the latest box office hit in the DC cinematic universe. At least, that's what The Rock wants people to think. This isn't really a movie, as it feels more like one of those Injustice gameplay compilations, where two characters come out and say their quotes before engaging in a tensionless fight.
Superman modeled his government after mine. We allow no insurrection!
This film also probably has the last yay needle drop ever, so that was interesting. Death on the Nile genuinely made me feel seasick. The main issue I had with this film was the atrocious CGI backgrounds. All the characters were shot in beautiful 65mm film in front of green screens and then placed into digital Egyptian backgrounds. The characters never truly looked in their environments, and alongside bad lighting, this almost had a nauseating effect on me when I watched the movie. I'm very glad I saw this for free on HBO Max and not in theaters. Smile tries way too hard for its own good. When this film isn't fumbling incredibly heavy themes of trauma, it's comically bad. The shot of the pain rating scale genuinely made me laugh out loud because of how superficially deep it was. Don't even get me started on the birthday party scene with the obviously CGI dead cat. But what really spoiled the fun of this movie for me was its representation of trauma as a contagious pathogen that can only be escaped through death. I do not recommend this film to anyone. Tall Girl 2 is predictably bad. The premise of the Netflix original franchise is that the main character is trying to come to terms with her height. The problem is, though, that being tall is a complete non-issue, and the problems she has with bullying are completely unrealistic. The first film had this air of self-victimization that in its sequel is directly addressed, in a moment that feels so meta it almost breaks the fourth wall. This is a film about nothing. Don't watch it. Brazen is a Lifetime movie that somehow got released on Netflix. Basically, a crime novelist begins to investigate a string of cam girl murders after the passing of her sister, and eventually finds herself in a risque situation. This film is like if The Lost City took itself way too seriously, and that unintentionally makes it way funnier. The movie is honestly just boring. I'm sure your mom watched it though and had a great time. Judd Apatow's The Bubble was one of the least funny comedies of the year. The film bills itself as a searing takedown of Hollywood Corvid productions, especially one Jurassic-sized release from this year. Unfortunately though, most of the jokes feel like Judd venting about his frustration from the basic health and safety procedures put in place by production companies. I think we as a society need to stop making 2020 jokes or references going into the new year. Glass Onion was the last acceptable film to do it, now move on. The other jokes center around how out of touch Hollywood stars are with their staffers and the new generation of TikTok kiddies. These jokes could have landed at least a little better, but the film lacks any edge. Judd Apatow seems to be playing it safe by making softball criticisms of the industry he works in. The TikTok dancing scenes are somehow even worse though, and made me scramble for the remote each time a song began. It's stunning how somebody who released a George Carlin documentary the same year this came out struggles to be funny. I guess I'm no better. I'm a critic, not a very good filmmaker too. Quite honestly, the only two saving graces of this film were Pedro Pascal and Keegan-Michael Key, two men I'll watch anything for. This film is carrying on the tradition of parody movies by somehow being worse than the source material. The dreadful Jurassic World Dominion almost made the list, but I found Putting the Bubble here to be a far more fitting addition. At over 2 hours long, the bubble was too big not to burst. Pinocchio, the Disney one, is one of the most soulless films of the year. I could have swapped this entry with the Lionsgate Pinocchio, but that one was just a lazy English dub of a Russian film from last year. I feel like this Pinocchio is worse though, because of how it takes all the iconography and themes of the 1940s cartoon and waters them down for a new generation unnecessarily. I have to make an important distinction though. If you have a problem with Disney casting the new Blue Fairy as black, you seriously need to reevaluate your priorities. Ervio was chosen because of her award-winning theater career, not as forced diversity, as some critics say. The real problematic changes come in the form of things like Easter eggs in Geppetto's Clock Factory, or the changing of beer and cigars into root beer. These differences highlight Disney's philosophy when it comes to making new live-action films based on their animated classics. They don't care about the quality of the final product, they just want to move as many units as possible. Whether it be ticket sales or streaming figures, it's entertainment for parents to bring their kids to and have a nostalgia trip. In many ways, Disney has become just like the island of shadow monsters, trying to turn the kids into donkeys by not giving them addictive adult substance, but by giving them junk food. Does anyone remember R.I.P.D.? It was that one movie that was kinda like Men in Black, but instead of aliens, it was like ghosts or zombies, I don't remember. And instead of having his memory wiped, Ryan Reynolds was reincarnated as James Hong? Well, the franchise is back and more absurd than ever. The sequel, R.I.P.D. 2, Rise of the Damned, which is actually a prequel, is a western where a sheriff and Joan of Arc run around on a quest to stop a smoke monster. All of the 5 R.I.P.D. heads will be disappointed in this movie for retconning the first one, as Roy's backstory is entirely changed, alongside the rules of their mortal disguises and the way deados appear and act. Unfortunately, these issues are minor compared to how cheap the film is. This film was produced by Universal's 1440 direct-to-video division, and it has all of the hallmarks of their work. Cheap production design, lighting, and CGI make this film feel patently cheap and disposable. There's also the issue of the avatars. This concept did not work in the original, and it was rightly called out for setting up easy racist and misogynistic jokes. The gimmick returns in this film, but since the 2 white protagonists are reincarnated as black women in the 1800s, they try and use it for social commentary. Unfortunately though, despite the best efforts of the actresses, none of the scenes feel anything more than surface level. Anytime the film approaches a meaningful scene, the fantasy gimmicks interrupt it, like with Joan of Arc's PTSD attack when the sheriff burned a racist sign. At least the film is far less boring than the first one. Ice Age: The Adventures of Buck Wild is a direct-to-video mockbuster made by Disney. Because of the low budget and absence of most of the original voice cast, this film feels like a pale imitation of the first 5 Ice Age films in the series. The only returning voice actor is Simon Pegg, who I hope got a massive paycheck for this film and luck. The film functions as a spin-off centered around Buck Wild. Despite them being portrayed by impersonators, Manny, Sid, and Diego are far more interesting characters and were sorely missed in this film. The Adventures of Buck Wild is one of the ugliest animated films in recent memory, especially when compared to the Scrat Tales short series. I think this can be partially attributed to the teams that worked on each project. Scrat Tales was made by the original studio, Blue Sky Animation, before their closing. On the other hand, Buck Wild was produced by Bardell Entertainment, a studio mainly known for Rick and Morty, the Diary of a Wimpy Kid Disney Plus movies, and TV adaptations of animated films. I want to avoid making assumptions, but it seems like either nobody cared about this film, or it was produced on the same budget as the miniseries. There really isn't much else to say about this movie. It's just another disposable direct-to-video movie made to pad out the Disney Plus streaming library. Good Morning is the feature-length directorial debut of Machine Gun Kelly, one of the worst working artists right now. The film is a painfully unfunny and immature stoner comedy. I'm not ashamed to admit that stoner comedies are a guilty pleasure of mine. They're edgy, surreal comedies that never take themselves too seriously. However, this film, like the Machine Gun Kelly character, is incredibly fake. Good Morning is framed as a coming-of-age comedy, despite the fact that Colson Baker, Machine Gun Kelly's real name, is a 32-year-old man. Nothing of substance happens in this movie. MGK gets a text from his girlfriend where instead of saying good morning, it's spelled wrong. That's it. Well, he's also auditioning to play Batman in a future film, but I think a better casting decision would be for him to replace Jared Leto's Joker. There's nothing exciting or funny about watching a grown-ass man and his friends sit around and smoke. MGK is a terrible actor with horrible comedic timing, and the rest of the supporting cast aren't much better. MGK lets jokes go on for too long, like the one scene where he's making an acting reel with a cringe-inducing parody of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The only interesting moments are the celebrity cameos from Avril Lavigne, Danny Trejo, and Snoop Dogg. It's satisfying going back to watch MGK's appearance in Jackass Forever after suffering through Good Morning. Morbius is the latest entry in the Sony Venomverse that nobody wanted or asked for. The film centers around the Spider-Man villain and Midnight Sun's anti-hero Morbius, the living vampire. The film was incredibly unoriginal and highlights some of the franchise fatigue and confusion happening recently. The story of Morbius is entirely unoriginal and boring. It hits a lot of the same hurdles that held back Marvel's Phase 1, like a mundane, uninteresting origin story and a villain who ends up being little more than an evil copy of the protagonist. Not to mention all of the tired vampire tropes that Morbius draws upon, which are all softened up for the film's PG-13 audience. Morbius doesn't hold a candle to a movie like Guillermo del Toro's Blade 2, a film that originally included his character before being cut. The film also has a hard time finding its footing into the Venomverse. During the trailers, the film was marketed by showing shots of graffiti with Spider-Man and a character played by Michael Keaton. These shots mainly existed to confuse potential audiences into the theater, as the T-Spider-Man connection never paid off and the MCU's Vulture somehow landed into the Venomverse at the end of the film. It's still incredibly unclear how this film connects to Venom and the future El Muerto and Hypno Hustler films. Sony is grasping at straws with their character pool, and I doubt this film sparked an interest in the general public. Of course, these issues couldn't stop the Marvel Legends film from grossing over $1 billion. The film was the ultimate meme, even down to its release date of April 1st. I'm convinced this was a massive bit from the start. They/them is what happens when you base your entire production around a title pun. Unfortunately, the title was the only part of the film that they seemed to put effort into. The script of this film is atrocious, and the characters act unbelievably fake. The film was written and directed by John Logan, who writes like a 61-year-old man. All the characters are two-dimensional stereotypes, and pretty much exist just to be tortured. The rare exception to this being a short musical number in the middle of the film, where the campers sing the lyrics to F***ing Perfect, the 12-year-old Pink song. To call the writing out of touch would be an understatement. In addition, the horror set pieces, as few and far between as they are, struggle to make an impact. The resolution for this film is something that's been bothering me for a while. The ultimate message is that people who rise up against their oppressors are ultimately as bad as them. However, considering that they were literally psychologically tortured, I disagree with this conclusion. The film tries to take a centrist approach to appease its audience, but forgets that one side is almost entirely innocent. I doubt this film meant to be intentionally harmful, but the fact they cared more about picking the most SEO-optimized title over telling a good story shows Blumhouse's priorities. Blonde is a book that should have remained unadapted for the silver screen. The book Blonde is an almost entirely fictional biography based loosely on the life of Marilyn Monroe. The film Blonde is a gross exploitation film where its most shocking moments are ripped entirely from the book without the context of it being fictional. All the buzz leading up to this film was surrounding its rare NC-17 rating, which should have been telling that Blonde would have an obsession with fetishizing Marilyn Monroe. Throughout the film, Ana de Armas spends almost 10 minutes of screen time topless, and calls her partner's daddy over 24 times. The most invasive scenes, however, center around Monroe's alleged abortion. The basis for their inclusion in this film was that she suffered 3 miscarriages, attributed to endometriosis. This film, however, decided to depict her personal tragedy as a self-inflicted wound from an abortion that was depicted as a horrific nightmare. During another pregnancy later in the film, Norma talks to her fetus who begs her for life. This movie's gross pro-life sentiment feels especially tasteless when the film was released just 3 months after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the US. Quite honestly, the most confusing thing to me is that Ana de Armas justified making the film because Marilyn's ghost said it was alright. I'm certain the card that you and the rest of the cast wrote justified permanently changing the public perception surrounding Marilyn Monroe's legacy. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 is one of the worst horror movies ever. Before the film was released, it supposedly was receiving record low test screening scores, and they must have not changed much because the final product is atrocious. TCM is a reboot in the same vein as the recent Halloween sequels. The film is a direct sequel to the original and even brings back Sally for the first time. The town that Leatherface lives in is being taken over by Gen Z gentrifiers. After one of them accidentally kills Leatherface's adopted mother, he then goes on a rampage. One of the biggest issues with the movie is that it tries to grapple with complex societal issues but absolutely refuses to take a side. The director of the film explicitly stated that he didn't want the movie to make a statement on any of the political issues the film depicts. Making a movie with no themes is not the flex that the creative staff thinks it is, especially because Texas Chainsaw Massacre depicts some of the most mind-numbingly stupid political allegories. The film is anti-gentrification, but doesn't actually understand how gentrification works. The film is against the removal of Confederate imagery and shows someone practically getting murdered because their hate symbol represents their heritage. And most confusingly, the director even said that gun control could be bad because what if you're attacked by Leatherface? The whole school shooting aspect of this film is so incredibly poorly thought out and insensitive. I've seen firsthand how a deadly school shooting can devastate a community, and for the hacks who made this movie to exploit real-world tragedies in an attempt to elevate their shitty script is truly gross. On the topic of grossness, the kills and horror set pieces in this film are just fine. Nothing will ever have as much impact or weight as the original. This is really ironic because the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is incredibly subtle with its blood and gore. I think that was the issue with this movie. It's trying so hard to be like the original, but without understanding any of the themes and being obsessed with making it more. Perhaps the new one could have taken a page or two from the Tobe Hooper classic about subtlety. Well, at least another one that wasn't recreating the original ending with a self-driving car. What is a Woman is the most harmful film to release this year. This so-called documentary from right-wing blogger Matt Walsh is incredibly racist, misogynistic, and transphobic. I don't have the time to fully tear into this movie, so I'll link this thorough 4-hour-long analysis of the film. But to give you the short version, Matt Walsh is trying to find the answer to the titular question by interviewing subjects, and until he gets the answer he wants, he lies to, ignores, and mocks the subjects he chose for this propaganda piece. This film has the potential to inspire real-world violence because of how dishonest it is. Calling this a documentary or a movie is an insult to both mediums.